The Fascist State of Mind by Christopher Bollas, Genesis of Genocide, Being a Character. Part 1. Our program is simple, wrote Benito Mussolini in 1932. They ask us for programs, but there are already too many. It is not programs that are wanting for the salvation of Italy but men and willpower. 185. What is fascism? Asked Gramsci some 10 years before Mussolini's Spartan statement. It is the attempt to resolve the problems of production and exchange with machine gun fire and pistol shots. 82. Fascism seemed to simplify the ideological, theological, and cultural confusions that emerged from the failure of the Enlightenment view of man to comprehend human existence. It was, argues Fritz Stern, a conservative revolution constituting the ideological attack on modernity, on the complex of ideas and institutions that characterize our liberal, secular, and industrial civilization. 16. Where the Enlightenment had partly emphasized the integrity of individual man, 20th century fascism extolled the virtue of the state, an organic creation driven by the militant will of the masses. A sharp contrast indeed to the federal republic encumbered by checks and balances dividing power so that the people remained individually free to speak their minds in a pluralistic society. While Freud reconsidered the dark side of man's self, this idea never was free as a virtuous agent of the innate will of man. It became part of an internal federation of complex checks and balances, of ego working with superego against ID, or ID with superego in compromised negotiations with the ego. Freud rethought man and maintained some considerable belief in the power of reason to influence the ID, and even if his theory of the death instinct accounts for the possibility of a mass negation of life, he remained a Bismarckian with a sense of real politics. Life was to be an endless series of compromised solutions between the parts of the self. At the end of a Freudian life, it is possible to be a Montaigne, rendered far too wise by the mayoral negotiations of existence to characterize ontology as a pursuit of happiness, but nonetheless continuously respectful of the individual skills of man to negotiate a good enough life. Like many Europeans of his time, Freud deferred recognition of a deeply troubling factor in human culture, an element which preoccupies us now with its haunting relevance, the related issues of terror and genocide. In February 1915, the Ottoman government decreed that its Armenian population would lose the privileges of the ordinary civilian, and immediately the slaughter began. In that year, 800,000 Armenians were massacred, and although the Entente nations, Britain, France, Russia, protested to the Ottoman government and Arnold Toynbee collected a volume of essays testifying to the atrocities against the Armenians, this was to be a massacre that could not be inscribed in the symbolic orders of Western thought. References to it were scarce indeed. There is no mention in Freud's work of the elimination of 75% of the Armenian population. Nor indeed does he make more than a single reference to the pogroms that preceded it in European history. Although the genocide against the Jewish population in Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, seems an irreplaceable icon to evil in the 20th century mind, we may wonder if its ironic function, the Jew now used once again to serve as a point of projection, is to serve as a consummated mental negation of the continuation of genocide. We seem to know this, as citizens of the Western world do try not to eliminate from their thoughts the re-emergence in Cambodia of the Khmer Rouge, which put to death millions of people. Never forget, the cry of the Holocaust victim seems a tellingly apt injunction. We seem all too able to forget. Terror is the realization of the law of movement. Its chief aim is to make it possible, writes Hannah Arendt, for the force of nature or of history to race freely through mankind unhindered by any spontaneous human actions. Is genocide, the mass implementation of terror, social license to remake the world according to one's vision? Those who are not of my species are not my fellow men. A noble is not one of my species. He is a wolf and I shoot. O'Sullivan, 49. So spoke a French revolutionary. And from 3 executions a week in 1793 to 32 a week in early 1794, the revolutionaries executed, on average, 196 people a week in the summer of 1794. But a noble is not man but wolf, so is this the destruction of a lowly creature? In genocide, a person is killed for who he is, not for what he does, which prompts Cooper to pose an uncomfortable question, as there is a thoroughgoing dehumanization of the bourgeoisie in the Communist Manifesto. Is it possible to see this intellectual act as a precondition for Stalin's elimination of such bourgeois elements in his death camps? 95. In other words, is this famous act of Marxist objectification, the vilification of the bourgeoisie to which thousands of intellects since that time have paid lip service, the warrant for killing some 20 million human beings in the years between 1919 and 1939, 59? In the perestroika world created by Mikhail Gorbachev, it now seems not only possible, but equally essential to think not only about what we have done, but about who we are, or what we are, when we license genocide. As a psychoanalyst, I turn my attention to that frame of mind, which is the warrant for the extermination of human beings. I term it the fascist state of mind, knowing that in some respects this is historiographically incorrect, as fascism was a particular movement in world history with highly unique features to it. But I justify this license by playing on the double meaning of the word state. There was a fascist state. The coming into being of that state and its political theory can tell us quite a lot about another state, the state of mind that authorized a fascist theory. Furthermore, like it or not, fascist is now a metaphor in our world for a particular kind of person, and I wish to reserve this ironic scapegoating of the fascist from the convenient movement of its personification of evil, as, like Wilhelm Reich and Hannah Arendt, I shall argue that there is a fascist in each of us, and that there is indeed a highly identifiable psychic profile for this personal state. Noel O'Sullivan, a political theorist and author of a fine study of fascism, dismisses the psychoanalytical literature on fascism as dangerously complacent, since it merely explains fascism away by pushing it out of sight into a psychiatric ward. He disagrees with Martin Wange's view, 247, that the idealization of Hitler relieved homosexual tensions through submission to the leader, and objects to this and other analytical studies of Nazi pathology as failing to explain why other nations whose children were left fatherless in the First World War did not produce successful Führers and Nazi-type mass movements. Psychoanalytic studies, he continues, explain everything and therefore tell us nothing. They assume that any sane person would be a liberal, and once this hidden postulate is granted, it naturally follows that those who dislike parliamentary institutions, respond to nationalistic appeals, and show a taste for heroism and self-sacrifice are the victims of some psychological disorder. The psychoanalytic argument, O'Sullivan concludes, ultimately claims that fascists are the insane and liberals and psychoanalysts are the sane. 27. Some analytic studies of the Nazi movement may have suggested that there was an illness peculiar to the Germans, and if such a disorder is regarded as an idiosyncrasy of culture and history, then I would join O'Sullivan in regarding such psychoanalytical positions as worryingly simplistic. It is my understanding of a prominent feature of psychoanalysis that the pathology found in the fascist movement is inside each of us, and that one aim of a training analysis is to provide the analyst to be with the evidence of neurotic and psychotic processes within the ordinary self. Indeed, I shall argue that it is possible to be both a liberal believing in a parliamentary world and yet capable of developing a fascist frame of mind. I thus find no contradiction between a belief that a world of checks and balances mitigates genocide and the view that as the fascist state of mind is ordinary, it can indeed subvert the democratic mind. There is a view now fairly common in psychoanalysis that the subject is composed of varied parts of the self. These parts are the ordinary functioning parts of the mind, i.e., the workings of the mind according to Freud, Klein, Fairbairn, and Winnicott, and the differing selves and objects represented in this internal world. It is rather like a parliamentary order with instincts, memories, needs, anxieties, and object responses finding representatives in the psyche for mental processing. When under the pressure of some particularly intense drive, such as greed, or force, such as envy, or anxiety, such as the fear of mutilation, this internal world can indeed lose its parliamentary function and evolve into a less representative internal order, particularly as differing parts of the self are projected out into other objects, leaving the mind denuded of its representative constituents. To see the mind's move to fascism, we need to consider just how this democratic order is changed. How does one their increased omnipotence and mechanization of self as they transcended the death feeling? German genocide, argues Lifton, emerged from the sense of death that followed on from the First World War, a war that left Germans with a profound experience of failed regeneration, 468. A sense of collective illness pervaded the country, leading to a vision of total cure for 70, which the charismatic Hitler provided. The cure that becomes genocide, according to Lifton, must be total, invincible, transcendental. The victim of genocide is designated a disease that could contaminate the self and must therefore be eliminated, sponsoring a genocidal necessity that is a fierce purification procedure. 482. The fascist state of mind. Whatever the factors that sponsor any specific social act of genocide, the core element in the fascist state of mind, in the individual or the group, is the presence of an ideology that maintains its certainty through the operation of specific mental mechanisms aimed at eliminating all opposition. But the presence of ideology, either political, theological, or psychological, is hardly unusual. Indeed, it is quite ordinary. The core of the fascist state of mind, its substructure, let us say, is the ordinary presence of ideology, or what we might call belief or conviction. Arendt finds the seeds of totalitarianism in ideology because ideologies claim total explanation, divorce themselves from all experience, from which they cannot learn anything new, insisting therefore on the powerful possession of a secret truth that explains all phenomena and operates from a logic which orders facts to support the ideological axiom. 470-71. Thus something almost banal in its ordinariness, namely, our cohering of life into ideologies or theories, is the seed of the fascist state of mind when such ideology must, for whatever reason, become total. To achieve such totality, the mind or group can entertain no doubt. Doubt, uncertainty, self-interrogation are equivalent to weakness and must be expelled from the mind to maintain ideological certainty. This is accompanied, in my view, by a special act of binding as doubts and counterviews are expelled, and the mind ceases to be complex, achieving a simplicity held together initially by bindings around the signs of the ideology. Political slogans, ideological maxims, oaths, material icons, such as the flag, fill the gap previously occupied by the polysemousness of the symbolic order. When the mind had previously entertained in its democratic order the parts of the self and the representatives of the outside world, it was participant in a multifaceted movement of many ideas linked to the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real Lacan's terms. Specifically, words, as signifiers, were always free in the democratic order to link to any other words, in that famous Lacanian slide of the signifiers which expressed the true freedom of the unconscious, this other, to represent itself. But when representational freedom is foreclosed, signifiers lack this freedom, as ideology freezes up the symbolic order, words becoming signs of positions in the ideological structure. When Michael Dukakis tried to introduce complex issues in the American presidential campaign of 1988, George Bush made the word liberal a sign of weakness visited upon the certain mind by doubt and complexity. To supplement his destruction of the symbolic order, Bush made the American flag the sign of the difference between Dukakis and himself. Sadly, it signified the end of discourse and the presence of an emergent fascist frame of mind. As the empty binding of the order of signs constitutes an act of desemiosis, it enables the mind to function in a highly simplified way, cushioned initially by the success of such binding. O'Sullivan believes there is a martial sense to fascism, which I shall define here as a binding of mental forces to create a sense capable of murder. In a way, the elimination of the symbolic, of polysemousness, is the first murder committed by this order, as the symbolic is the true subversion of ideology. The slide of signifiers will always dissipate a bound meaning and subvert any act of solidarity, a fact which Freud showed so very simply in his numerous demonstrations of how the parapraxis subverts the position of the conscious subject. Aware of the pathological functions of certainty, Freud wrote in The Future of an Illusion, an inquiry which proceeds like a monologue, without interruption, is not altogether free from danger. One is too easily tempted into pushing aside thoughts which threaten to break into it, and in exchange, one is left with a feeling of uncertainty which in the end one tries to keep down by over-decisiveness. 21. Ideological certainty, then, in spite of its binding of the self through simplification and the exile of other views, is threatened by the sudden breakthrough of the pushed-aside thoughts, which now must be dynamically ordered by an over-decisiveness. This will work for some time, perhaps for a long time. Stuart Hampshire claims that the Nazi movement created a dizzying sense in German minds that all things are possible and that nothing is forbidden, and that there is an infinite moral space now open for natural violence and domination. 69. The psychoanalyst Janine Schaskets-Mergel sees this infinite moral space as the pervert's accomplishment eliminating, at first Oedipal, opposition to desire and gaining objects without opposition. Hampshire argues that the violence inherent in the Nazi moral space has left a great vacancy, a moral void. 69, which psychoanalysts such as Schaskets-Mergel, Kahn, and Stoller, who study the perversions, would agree lies at the now empty heart of the pervert. The moral void created by the simplifying violence of an ideology that brooks no true opposition is also an essential consequence of this stage in the evolution of the fascist state of mind. For although the binding of signs and the power of certainty dull the subject into complacency, the moral void created by the destruction of opposition begins to make its presence felt. At this point, the subject must find a victim to contain that void, and now a state of mind becomes an act of violence. On the verge of its own moral vacuum, the mind splits off this dead core self and projects it into a victim henceforth identified with the moral void. To accomplish this transfer, the fascist mind transforms a human other into a disposable nonentity, a bizarre mirror transference of what has already occurred in the fascist self-experience. As contact with the moral void is lost through projective identification into a victim, and the victim now exterminated, the profoundly destructive processes involved are further denied by a form of delusional narcissism, which is constructed out of the annihilation of negative hallucination, an idealization of self accomplished by the negation of any alternative, and thus enviable or persecutory, self or environment. As the negation of the qualities of the other are destroyed via the annihilation of the other, a delusional grandiosity forms in the fascistically stated mind. It is at this point that the process of annihilation is idealized in order to supply the fascist mind with the qualities essential to delusional narcissism. Mental contents are now regarded as contaminates, and the fascist mind idealizes the process of purging itself of what it has contained. The cleansing of the self suggests the possible birth of a new, forever empty self to be born with no contact with others, with no past, which is severed, and with a future entirely of its own creation. The foregoing mental processes can be seen, in some respects, in Nietzsche's semi-autobiographical Ecce Homo. At a time when he suffered from continuous episodes of vomiting, traveling about Europe, he became preoccupied with the question of nutriment, by which he meant not only literally what one ate, but also what sort of national culture one took into oneself. He proclaimed, for example, that the German spirit is an indigestion, while extolling the virtues of Italian culture and life. 52. Ecce Homo is, by any account, a deeply anguished text, full of contradictions, which, if they evoke our interest and compassion, are nonetheless remarkable actions of split consciousness. I am by nature warlike, he proclaims. 47. Yet elsewhere he claims, no trace of struggle can be discovered in my life. I look out upon my future as upon a smooth sea, ruffled by no desire. 65. Perhaps this is a sea of vomit, accomplished through a continuous warlike spirit that leaves men feeling serene. I refer to Nietzsche because at times he defines quite precisely the unconscious idealization of the self as an empty, and therefore pure, container. I possess a perfectly uncanny sensitivity of the instinct for cleanliness, he writes, adding that this instinct has given him a sense of smell for the unclean innermost parts, the entrails of every soul, which are the cause of his disgust. No doubt in such moments he would have to vomit up these noxious internal objects in order to maintain his sense of inner purity. As has always been customary with me, and extreme cleanliness in relation to me is a presupposition of my existence. I perish under unclean conditions. 48. Such a state of mind extols the virtue of being pure, uncontaminated, because nothing is taken into the self, the psyche living from its sense of antiseptic accomplishment by maintaining purity in its own right, achieved by the continuous oral evacuation of the noxious. We can find this phenomenon, however, in ordinary life, whether it be spoken by those who attempt to claim the position of pure Christianity, pure objectivity, pure science, or, dare I say, pure analysis. The greater the annihilation of the opposition, the more delusionally narcissistic the fascist mind must become, a psyche now empty of ideas other than those performing a pure sign function to bind the state of mind. a mind that idealizes itself as a cleaning process. It is not difficult to see, then, why the fascists did not share the Marxists' belief in a logical history, but supported a movement that idealized struggle, or riddance, in its own right. As Mussolini wrote, "War alone brings up to their highest tension all human energies and puts the stamp of nobility upon the peoples who have the courage to meet it." Fascism carries this anti-pacifist struggle into the lives of individuals. It is education for combat. War is to man what maternity is to the woman. I do not believe in perpetual peace. Not only do I not believe in it, but I find it depressing and a negation of all the fundamental virtues of man. 185. But this so-called struggle is, in fact, no combat at all. How far are we indeed from that noble warfare found in the chivalric code of the Song of Roland, when the virtue of one's opponents ennobled the act of physical battle? What is this male maternity to which Mussolini refers? Is it not the death camps, where the living are brought to a container, stripped of their culture, their loved ones, their adult characters, and turned into bizarre fetuses eventually to be killed in this deadly womb? Some who opposed fascism, such as Giovanni Zabordi, were able to diagnose the fascist need to be at war. In 1922, in Towards a Definition of Fascism, he wrote that after the First World War, the officers sympathize with fascism because it represents a prolongation of the state of war internally, and of a possibility of war externally. 89. Psychoanalytically considered, this permanent war is actually against struggle, against the conflicts brought on by continued engagement with opposition views. The idealization of war and of the warrior is a call to a state of mind that rids itself of opposition by permanent violence. Kata suggests that there is a circuit of depersonalization conducted by the person who submits to domination by passing on to another victim his own circumstance. Violence has its origins and triumphs within the circuit of depersonalization thus actuated, which ultimately leads to a dispossession of oneself. 63. This loss of self seems to me to be that loss of humanity to which Brenman referred, and which leaves in its place an idolized skeleton, a figure, leader, ideology, or state, revered for its militant capacity. In the end, an idealization of the capacity to murder the self. Thus, the concentration camp, a metaphor of the psychic process of fascism, is the place where, as the humane parts of the self are dehumanized and then exterminated, the death work is idealized in the death workers who cleanse the body politic of the undesirables. As Susan Sontag argues, when illness is used as a metaphor for the opposition, then the act of elimination is viewed only as a necessary surgical intervention. Reference to the opposition as a disease or cancer that must be removed from society and mind is a frequent feature of the fascist mental state, leading eventually to an idealization of the anti-human. Writing of the mobile killing units of the SS, Leo Cooper muses that the ideal seems to have been that of the dispassionate, efficient killer engaged in systematic slaughter in the service of a higher cause. 122. Higher here is a metaphor of that grandiosity that achieves nobility by rising above the human. Cooper quotes from an address by the chief of the SS to his top commanders in October 1943. Most of you know what it means when 100 corpses lie there, or when 500 corpses lie there, or when 1,000 corpses lie there. To have gone through this, and apart from a few exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent, that has made us great. 122.